This morning, Cubans are suffering from the third nationwide blackout this month, leaving 10 million people without power, according to Cuba's Ministry of Energy. The country's power grid collapsed Saturday evening as the government struggles with the decaying infrastructure and a U.S.-imposed oil blockade. The blackout comes as President Trump is doubling down on hints of imminent change for Cuba. In response to what the U.S. would do with the country, President Trump told MS Now's Stephanie Ruhle in a phone call on Friday, quote, "You just watch. It's going to be Cuba's seen better days." This comes after the president warned that Cuba could, quote, see the end, and that the United States may be, quote, taking the island nation. Joining us now is journalist and MS Now contributor Paula Ramos. Paula, thanks for joining us early this morning. What exactly does it look like if Trump were successful in taking Cuba?
You know, I think this is, so for context, my grandfather was a political prisoner, in Cuba in the 60s, and he died 2 years ago. And so I think about him a lot because I think this is a moment that I think Cuban exiles have romanticized for many years. When they thought about the end of Cuba, when they thought if there were ever to be a scenario when the Cuban regime would be frail and weakened, they believed that what would ensue would be a couple of things. Certainly political change, certainly free and fair elections, and certainly some type of demilitarization of the island. And I think what you're staring at is none of the above. Right. And so the type of change that I think we all imagined and romanticized is not at all what it looks like could happen, because what seems like is going to happen is some type of Venezuelan playbook, right, where essentially the Trump administration will oust, most likely, Miguel Diaz-Canel, who's the current president. And perhaps what the reporting seems to indicate is that the Castro regime, the essence of the regime, which is still Raul Castro, the brother of Fidel Castro, that he would still be the de facto leader. And so I say all this because it is something that I think a lot of people, both in the island and outside of the island, have to come to terms with, that whatever change was ever imagined is not at all what will happen.
One of the things that is, I try to remember in these moments is that people can hold two things in their head at once, right? These Cuban exiles in Miami, for example, have waited decades for something like this to happen, right? But the experience of regime change that we have seen under this president and other presidents in our history also gives people a lot of evidence that this doesn't always work out for the benefit of the United States, and it's definitely not for the country in which we are changing the regime, right? Like if Trump goes and takes over Cuba, still don't know what that means. If he does that, the immigration that could happen there, what's going to get worse in Cuba is going to change the immigration process here in this country, and the amount of people who will raise their hands and will accurately say, we are refugees, we need assistance, you came over here and caused an issue. So talk a little bit about the Cuban exiles having to being able to hold both of those thoughts in their head as we move forward.
Look, I think you're totally right. I think Cubans are up against these impossible scenarios, which is, do we have a better chance at change, right, under the current totalitarian Castro regime, which is weakened, right, which is also a regime that we always have to say it, where political opposition is illegal? Or is there suddenly some type of better alternative and pathway to change under a type of new Trumpist, neo-colonialist approach, right? And these are two completely impossible scenarios, right? And so I think the Cuban exile community right now is not a monolith. I think there are a lot of people that do want to see regime change and intervention. I think a lot of Cuban American members of Congress want that. You have others that don't believe in that approach. I think what's interesting, though, is that a majority of these Cuban exiles at some point were very much against what Barack Obama did in 2014, which is actually kind of a very similar scenario that we have in front of us right now, right? In 2014, Barack Obama essentially said, you know what, let's talk to the regime. Let's open up the market. Let's start some type of negotiations and travel, and let's see if change happens, which is essentially what Trump is trying to do in a way more aggressive form. And every single person in the hardline Cuban exile community was against that approach. So I think now many of them are trying to come to terms with a couple of scenarios, right? Is change gradual? Or does change have to be imminent? And I think what Marco Rubio, who's obviously the son of Cuban exiles, is essentially telling the Cuban exile community is, wait, No, wait a couple of years because change is gradual. I think what scares a lot of people in the Cuban ISIL community, though, is that Cuba suddenly could become a type of Vietnam, no, a type of China, where you have a single party communist system with an open market, no, with capitalism, with a constant dialogue with Washington, D.C. Just last month, Marco Rubio met with the foreign minister of Vietnam, and that maybe is what pragmatism looks like, right? Is I think, in the island, and that's a whole other conversation, right? I think they're holding all of these truths at the same time. They're desperate. They feel the embargo. They feel the blockade. And they also know that this crisis has been in the making since the 60s.
Paola Ramos, we will continue to cover this, and that means you need to be on standby to help us dig through it. So thank you very much, my friend.
Thank you.